am a Roma activist and scholar, originally from Romania, lived in different countries. So I do have an international dimension, but that fits with my Roma identity. Welcome, everyone. It's an honor to be here today and to speak about two subjects that are of great interest to me. And let me share this with you. First time when I heard about Roma Holocaust, and not necessarily under the term Holocaust, was when I was 5 years old. And I heard that from my grandparents, because in my grandparents' house, there were very often very interesting discussions about Roma history, literature, including what happened during the Second World War. And of course, as I grew up, there was nothing in the school curricula or something that we learn from in the public. At that time, I was still okay, because it was under communism, and somehow everybody knew that there is a divide between what is public, what is official, and what is unofficial. The challenge became rather in post-communism with the abundance of information, and that was easily manipulated. And nowadays, with the new technologies, I think we do have huge challenges ahead of us. Antigypsyism is very dear to me because I dedicated the past 7-8 years, if not more, to this project. I organized summer schools at the Central European University on anti-Gypsyism. I taught courses at different universities in Germany, in Hungary, and in Romania. And I was invited by different organizations, including ERIAC and the Council of Europe, to contribute to different events speaking about anti-Gypsyism. So for me, it's a really great honor to be here and to contribute to spreading the knowledge and interact with people that are interested in this topic. So I'd like to share with you my presentation, and I apologize for not having probably the best visuals. Of course, it would have been perfect to have in person this meeting, but we adapt to the conditions, and therefore here it is. Yeah. Try to have it on full screen, the presentation. Apologize for the...
You can go to the slideshow bottom on the top.
Yeah, just a moment to have it exactly. Okay, so if this would have been an in-person meeting, I would have asked you, when have you heard first time, when you have your first memories of the Roma Holocaust? I think that's not possible now. But I do want to ask you something now, and you can answer in the chat. Do you think Holocaust, Roma Holocaust, is still possible today? And just answer simply yes or no. Don't need sophisticated answers, yeah, for this. Today's session, yeah, which lasts for 90 minutes, yeah, has some objectives that might sound quite generous, but still I prefer to have them. On the one hand, we aim to understand the historical roots and evolution of anti-Gypsyism, to trace the ideological path from medieval persecution to Holocaust and to understand what are the differences, but also to develop some practical pedagogical tools for teaching Roma Holocaust, and of course, apply critical pedagogy approaches to contemporary education. So let's proceed with anti-Gypsyism. And of course, we have to define exactly what does it mean. Now, those of you familiar with anti-Roma racism or anti-Gypsyism, yeah, might know that there are different definitions provided by international organizations, including the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance of the Council of Europe, then the Alliance Against Anti-Gypsyism, a platform bringing together Roma and non-Roma NGOs and experts, and of course, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And I would say that all these definitions have, in a way, are confusing the reader with different meanings and so on. But they have all a common element. They define anti-Gypsyism as a form of racism. And I think that's really important. So based on previous research in the Western Balkans and Turkey, but also on an in-depth research in Kosovo that included, surveys, focus groups, and interviews with experts and Roma Ashkali and Egyptians, and other research covering countries in Central and Eastern Europe that I conducted in the past 6 years. I propose the following definition. Anti-Gypsyism is a special form of racism directed against those stigmatized in the public imaginary, in the social imaginary, as gypsies, Tsigoiner, Tatars, Tsingari, or other related terms that have as core assumptions that they are inferior and deviant group, and we justify their dominance and oppression. Now, this definition has also another advantage, that one can easily operationalize it. Yeah. But let's talk about some other assumptions of anti-Gypsyism. One we talked already was inferiority. As any form of racism, anti-Gypsyism also presupposes demarcation, a line of superiority and inferiority. Yeah, and you might know that through our history, Roma have been perceived by the majority society as less human and rather closer to the animal world. Yeah, and you can see that even nowadays, how media describes Roma. Deviance. Now, this is also a very important point because criminality is associated with Roma in a very interesting way. And there are sayings, popular sayings, even sometimes data, and, showing that in a way, this criminality is a genetic characteristic of the Roma, is in their blood. Yeah. Now, we have Orientalism. Orientalism, which is a concept borrowed from Edward Said book in 1977, Orientalism, wants to emphasize in the case of Roma the non-European roots of Roma, which in a way justify their exclusion. Yeah, the fact that they are not there. But also there are other subtle mechanisms that come with this Orientalism applied to Roma, that they are a bit naive, not so clever, and therefore it's easy to deal with them or to trick them. Now, nomadism is a really important assumption. Why? Because even nowadays, when the overwhelming majority of Roma are in Europe are settled, yeah, the perception of the majority is still that, they are unstable, that they want to move around. And therefore, throughout our history, this characteristic, this assumption of nomadism, yeah, has a continuum. We were always depicted as unstable and therefore untrustworthy, yeah, because nobody can trust if they move around, yeah. Rootlessness, the lack of collective memory and belonging, is related also to Romani identity. Academia also played an important role in shaping this perception of Roma as a rootless people, as a group that doesn't have an identity. And when it comes to Holocaust, it's really important, the lack of a collective memory, that we do not commemorate. And my answer to that was that usually these ideas were promoted by non-Roma scholars that did not understand that certain topics are kept within Roma families and they do not share with the Gage. So the fact that they were unable to grasp these dimensions and to gain the trust of Roma communities to share with them their experiences, yeah, made them state that Roma do not commemorate, yeah, Holocaust, while in fact Roma had knowledge, and but those were really in closed circles. Backwardness is another important assumption of anti-Gypsyism. Roma have been depicted as primitive and uncivilized, not adapting to the rules of the society, and therefore requiring assimilation. We can see even nowadays within the educational policies throughout Europe that this assumption is still embedded in such policies. The idea is to civilize the Roma, put them in school, and if we manage to teach them to read and write, that would be enough. They never consider the real equality that Roma children deserve to receive equal quality education like anyone else. And they should also receive the support for doing that. Therefore, backwardness play an important role in the assimilationist policies that were developed, especially in the past century. Now, of course, all these assumptions, you cannot separate them very clearly. Yeah, some of them might overlap, but it's important to spell them out and to analyze the racism against Roma based on these assumptions, because that gives the core and the meaning of what racism against Roma is, helps us identify the mechanisms through which racism against Roma works and what are the consequences of this. Of course, we'll have a Q&A session, and I will be happy to answer this. But now I just want to move a bit to our topic better and to look at the historical roots and the long path to the genocide of the Roma, to the Holocaust of Roma. And I just want to show some elements, historical elements that led to Holocaust. Yeah. So here is some chronological events that I think are important to be mentioned. On the one hand, one of the early mentions of Roma in Europe in medieval time was a document from 1385, which showed that Roma were slaves. Yeah, this was the first documented enslavement in the Romanian principalities of Wallachia and Moldova. Yeah, and slavery lasted for 5 centuries there. If you don't know anything about it, well, it's also because this was only marginally mentioned everywhere. Yeah. However, now there are some scholars, proud to mention that some of them are Roma that do research on this topic, and hopefully their publications and their PhD theses will be widespread, will become widespread knowledge in the years to come. Then, in one of the first mentioning of Roma in Western Europe is in what is nowadays Italy, when the anonymous chronicles of Bologna describe Roma as darker-skinned, ugly heathens. And, why this is important is because at that time, the medieval form of racism was targeting Jews and Muslims, yeah, and especially the role of the Inquisition in Spain, and not only, was crucial in targeting these groups. However, when it came to Roma, the exclusion was based very much, and the racism against Roma was very much based on skin color. Yeah, the racism against Jews and Muslims at the time was based on religious grounds. So what we notice here is the appearance of the modern form of racism that is very much and more sophisticated. We'll see other steps later on. Well, after their arrival in Western Europe, after a brief period of coexistence with the majorities, Roma became, let's call them, public enemy. And we see this in 1497. The German Diet accused Roma of spying for Turks and ordered their expulsion. Yeah. Also the fact that Roma could be killed without a trial. Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, 2 years later, the Spanish kings, through a law, ordered the expulsion of Roma from Spain because they were perceived as spies for the Arabs at the time. So it's interesting how the same group can be regarded as spies for either Ottomans or for Arabs, yeah, without having any proofs, of course. But the Roma experience in Western Europe did not stop there. In the 15th and 16th century, what was called gypsy hands and, organized violence and collective punishment of Roma, were quite widespread practices, also in what is nowadays Germany, but also Netherlands, Belgium, and other countries. Well, in Spain, we had the great Roma roundup. There were mass arrests, and this was in fact a very coordinated effort of the Spanish kingdom to get rid of the Roma. So luckily, the coordination and the implementation of the orders were not as they were planned. Also, Roma opposed these orders, and therefore they managed to survive. And nowadays we do have quite a significant Roma community in Spain. We also have to mention the Habsburg Empire assimilation policies starting at the end of 18th century, which continued throughout the 19th century. The Emperor Joseph II, issued several imperial bills for forcibly settlement of Roma, for placing Roma children, taking them away from Romani families and placing them in foster care, and giving new names to Roma, including the use of the word Roma in public was banned. They were called new peasants or new Hungarians. And of course, it was the prohibition of Romani language. So strong assimilationist policies. And all this was done with the aim of civilizing Roma. When it comes to academia, we have in the 18th century the first scientific classification of Roma. Now, that was very trendy already by mid-century when Carl Linnaeus started the classification of plants and animals and humans as well. But Heinrich Grellman, did a classification of Roma, and that was the first time when prejudices towards Roma received academic validation, because Heinrich Grellman was appointed a professor at different universities, and therefore, universities as sanctuaries of knowledge validated the kind of knowledge produced by these academics. And we note, therefore, the beginning of mass gypsy stereotype. Even nowadays, some of Grellman's writings still inform Romani studies on a scale that many of you would not believe. Then we had different forced sterilization programs at the beginning of 20th century, based on eugenic theories. And many of these programs continued until late in the 20th century. Then we had the pre-Nazi persecution, with police registration, concentration camps, and of course the race law in the 30s. But maybe it's important to mention that here in Germany, where I currently live, there was a training manual that was printed in first time, if I remember correctly, in 1896, and then in 1906, it was re-edited few times, and that manual was used for training police on how to spot, how to interact with gypsies. And the training manual was still in use by the police until 1970s. Then, of course, we have the Nazi extermination policies where, up to 500,000 Roma have been murdered. Yeah. Well, I did also classification of the extreme forms of historical oppression of Roma. Now, so on the one hand, we have slavery and human trafficking. And under this category, of course, we have 500 years of institutionalized slavery. Now, just imagine that, and those of you that know a bit about the African American community in US and the oppression, historical oppression of the African American community in US. But just to compare a little bit, the slavery in US was for 250 years. Imagine that for Roma lasted double the amount. Then also the fact that Roma were bought and sold and given as gifts like objects. Yeah. It was also sexual exploitation and forced breeding because they wanted, really good workforce. Yeah. But the second form of historical oppression to talk about is the mass deportations. It was a systematic removal from different territories. Yeah. Death marches with inadequate provisions, when entire communities were destroyed and scattered. And this is not something that happened, hundreds of years ago. This continues even nowadays. And I'll just give you two examples. Yeah, one of a community that has been destroyed and scattered is Sulucule in Istanbul or in Sevilla in Spain during the 90s. Yeah. So the next extreme forms of historical oppression we might talk is what is in academia called cultural genocide. Now, this might sound very strong, but let's see what kind of acts we put under this category. On the one hand, it's the destruction of language and traditions. We have also forced conversion to Christianity and erasure of identity from historical records. Nowadays, probably the forced conversion to Christianity happen less. But the destruction of language and traditions continues. In spite of being recognized as a national minority that has certain rights to protection of its own identity and language, Romani language is not taught only in exceptional cases, but do not enjoy the same protection like any other minority language in Europe. And that is highly documented. In fact, Romani language is an endangered language classified as such by UNESCO. And the number of speakers of Romani language is decreasing. And we can see that, in censuses, but also in our everyday life. The fact that information about Roma history and culture is not included into the mainstream curricula, not only that stimulates the anti-Roma racism through ignorance, yeah, but also erases our identity and presence, yeah, in Europe. Another form of extreme historical oppression is the medical experimentation on Roma. On the one hand, here we talk about forced sterilization without consent, and this practice continued in communism and in post-communism. It was also documented in Norway and Sweden. And, this is not something that just happened under the Nazis. Then there were eugenic experiments on Roma prisoners. And probably you all know about the rather infamous Dr. Mengele, yeah, who conducted medical experiments on children, Roma children especially, in concentration camps in Auschwitz and other places. And it was, of course, the deliberate infection with diseases for studies. So medical experimentation is something that still has to be better documented and talked about in public. Of course, we have judicial persecution, yeah, with special laws targeting Roma specifically, and that already happened in the 16th century. Yeah, I showed at the end of 15th century in what is now Germany and Spain, but also in UK. In 1530, and then it became quite a practice. But we do have other places where we have special laws indirectly targeting the Roma. And not only that, there are also certain judicial practices that target Roma. Then is the collective punishment for individual crimes. This continues to happen, and in Romania, for example, during the 90s, there were a series of racial attacks against the Romani communities based on individual crimes committed allegedly by Roma individuals, and then the revenge was against the whole community, set their houses on fire, and many community had to leave their houses and places and could not return for years. But we also know about collective punishment in, for example, Kosovo, yeah, and what went on there during the war, and the challenges of returning to Kosovo. Then death penalty for minor offenses, or, for example, as it happened in Portugal, in Spain, but also in the Italian cities at the time, at the end of 15th and 16th century, were punishing Roma much harder than other criminals, yeah, and with punishments that were outside of the law. And last but not least, we have economic exploitation, yeah, forced labor in mines and agriculture, no compensation for the work performed. I'd mention here specifically the case of Romania, where the Romanian Orthodox Church, one of the largest slave owners, yeah, even nowadays refuses to acknowledge that slavery was a form of oppression. On the contrary, they try to change the narratives and to justify Roma slavery as a kind of civilizational mission, but also humanitarian support to Roma. Confiscation of property and possessions, very often, yeah. Throughout history, this happened, from confiscation of horses and carts, yeah, carriages, to you know, their own land and houses, or even destruction of destroying their improvised houses in ghettos and bidonvilles. All these played an important role in creating an environment where Holocaust could happen. An important development at the end of 19th century and the beginning of 20th century that predated Nazi policies towards Roma was the development of eugenics as a form of scientific racism. And it's important to mention that Sir Francis Galton coined the term eugenics as the study of agencies under social control that may improve or impair the rational qualities of future generations. In fact, during the industrialization, and industrialization, I'm really sorry, let me restart. Industrialization led to a process of urbanization, especially in Central and Western Europe. And now authorities were concerned on how to control these masses and also how to improve their life. And eugenics appeared as an attempt to improve the life of different communities. Yeah, so it was generous in this sense. But then it developed also in different streams. One of them was, for example, racial hygiene. Yeah, and it developed in such a way and in a relatively short time. Yeah, that included also journals where they published academic articles and theories. Yeah, and let's just give some of the theorists of this, in addition to Sir Francis Galton, yeah, Charles Davenport and Harry Laughlin in USA, but also the infamous Robert Ritter in Germany. Yeah, and as you can see, yeah, we have the theory, but the way it was put in practice, yeah, really predated the Nazis' policies, or, you know, just built on already existing stereotypes and prejudices and practices and laws, but gave them now a scientific justification. So on the one hand, it was the positive eugenics that encouraged superior reproduction. But on the other hand, yeah, negative eugenics that led to the sterilization, segregation, and segregation of the unfit, those that were not seen desirable for the community. Oops. Where was the Roma connection? Of course, it came through Ritter, yeah, which affirmed that 90% of the Roma are of a mixed blood. And although they were originating from India, and according to Nazi science, race science, they should have been categorized as Aryans. In fact, because Ritter said that 90% are of mixed blood, so they are a degenerated race and they should be exterminated. So in that sense, Roma was an interesting case for the Nazi race sciences because, didn't fit their categorization, and some of them hated Roma additionally for that. Yeah. Well, here it is how this process of dehumanization happened. Yeah. And of course, how ideology becomes genocide. Yeah. On the one hand, it was the religion that played a role. Then the state played a major role in producing and reproducing anti-Gypsyism, and of course, sciences. Let's start with religion. Yeah. There are all kinds of Christian legends that Roma as children of Cain. And in fact, one of the first mentioning of Roma presence in Europe in 1322 by an Irish monk that traveled in the region, mentioned Roma as children of Cain. Now, this, of course, was a legend, but that spread even nowadays. It's still going on. Then, of course, Roma were accused of denying shelter to Holy Family. It's interesting, the fact, we don't know, in fact, if Roma were at the time there, but it doesn't matter, this aspect. The important is that they could be portrayed as denying shelter. Then in other legends is that Roma stole or forged nails for Christ's crucifixion. Yeah. Those of you that are aware, about the crucifixion of Christ, you see that they used only 3 nails. So the legend says that Roma stole the 4th, or so on. And then, of course, the association of Roma with devil and black magic. In fact, this led to a serious conflict with the church in the medieval time, that certain practices within Roma communities were outlawed by the church, were contradicting the religious practices of the majority, and therefore were heavily sanctioned. Yeah. And it's interesting to look into an aspect that is also gender related. Usually, throughout history, women were accused of witchcrafting. Yeah. So how many witches that were burned and sanctioned by the church, and were in fact of Roma origin? We do not find this information, and that's strange to me. Let's move on. The state. Well, on the one hand, states were the ones that created the legal frameworks for enslavement and exploitation of Roma. I mentioned earlier the gypsy hunts and the collective punishment, the forced settlements and assimilation policies, but also something that helped and which explains the current poverty among Roma throughout Europe is their systematic exclusion from land redistribution. Yeah, and that happened also, for example, following the Second World War, but also with the nationalization of land in the communist countries, and then the agricultural reform after the fall of communism. Yeah. As you know, historically, land was an important commodity, and the fact that Roma were excluded from the land redistribution led to an intergenerational poverty. Yeah. Academia played its own role in dehumanizing Roma. As I mentioned, yeah, at the end of 18th century, Grellman helped, or his book and his research on Roma led to the creation of a unified gypsy stereotype. Then the eugenic theories justifying the inferiority of the Roma. There were biopolitical regulation and population control all over. In fact, if you look at demographic experts, especially in certain countries where the population decrease is documented in the past decades, you will see these ideas that, even if the population of the country goes down, we have too many gypsies. Gypsies will take over. And this is quite common, let's say it, among demographers in Bulgaria, in Romania, in Hungary, yeah, but also in other countries. And of course, the scientific racism, yeah, includes the medical experiments and forced sterilization. All these practices are mechanisms of dehumanizing Roma, and that contributed significantly to the creation of conditions for the Holocaust. So, what happened? Yeah, in fact, after Nazis came to power, and then, of course, their allies. We cannot just blame Nazis in Germany. Their allies in different countries played also an important role in the persecution and killings of Roma. So the Nazi and their allies' policies against Roma targeted property confiscation, included property confiscation, ghettoization, creation of ghettos, and deportations of Roma, labor camps and extermination camps, medical experiments and collective massacres. Some of these were documented, and even now, a number of scholars are still working to document the collective massacres, the conditions, and the extermination in the camps. So what happened, in fact, is that we have nowadays an estimated 500,000 Roma murdered. When we say estimated, yeah, this number might be higher or lower, because in many countries, especially in those with significant Roma population, they did not keep proper records. So the numbers put forward, yeah, are just purely estimations. Entire communities were eliminated. Now, when we talk about attempt to get rid of Roma, of all Roma, we have to look at this important element that in certain countries, more than 90% of the Roma, yeah, communities were eliminated. Yeah, I talk here, for example, Croatia or Lithuania. in a way specific to Roma Holocaust, yeah, or Samudari Pen, is that on the one hand, the Roma Holocaust didn't end with the end of the Second World War, yeah. So a French scholar documented that the imprisonment in camps in France lasted until July 1946. So well after the end of the war in Europe and in general. And there is no justification for keeping Roma for such a long time after the end of the war. Yeah. So war ended. What, there were no more Nazis. Yeah. Their allies were already facing trials and punishment. So why these camps were still there and people in camps? Exclusion from official Holocaust commemoration. There were few attempts of Roma to be recognized along with Jews and others as victims of Holocaust. And even here in Germany, the Constitutional Court declared in Western Germany, yeah, because in the communist Germany, denazification happened simply by being occupied by the Soviets. In Western Germany, the Constitutional Court stated in 3 different decisions that Roma were punished because they were asocials and not because of their racial origin. Their antisocial behavior was the basis, not the races. And of course, there was very limited research and documentation. It was rather some private foundation that started. And Romani post Second World War, Romani movement in Germany, yeah, became strong when they struggled for the recognition of Roma as victims of Holocaust. And it was needed to have hunger strikes and demonstrations. So the German federal government recognized, yeah, after 3 years of such intense mobilization of Roma and Sinti here in Germany, to recognize that Roma were also part of the Holocaust victims. However, it took them until 2012 to have a monument of Roma Holocaust in Germany. Yeah. So even when they are victims and they are recognized as victims, still took, yeah, such a long time to have a formal commemoration of that. Here are, and I'll try to move a bit faster, yeah, some laws that were implemented in Nazi Germany, in Hungary, or in Romania and Croatia. These are just a few examples on how these policies were implemented. Yeah, on the one hand, we have the Nuremberg laws that expanded to Roma, the supplementary decrees, yeah, of the Nazis, where Roma became enemies of the race-based state, the Marzahn decree, Marzahn being nowadays a neighborhood of Berlin, yeah, where where one of the greatest, largest Roma camp happened here, and then deportations. Also in Hungary, yeah, with drafting gypsy work battalions, yeah, the exclusion, urban exclusion of the Roma, and the mass deportations, yeah. In Romania, where at least 25,000 were deported to the region of Transnistria. And we say at least 25 because in the trial of the fascist leader Ion Antonescu, the number of Roma deported mentioned there is 36,000. In other documents, this number is even higher, yeah, and informally, those that had access to the archives, to the military archives, yeah, mentioned that, you know, the number in fact was much higher. And of course, in Jasenovac's concentration camp, yeah, at least 15,000 have been killed. Well, here are some interesting data from 2019 research, which shows that Holocaust of Roma, at least in my opinion, might happen sooner than we think, because the hatred is there. If we look back in history, we see that everything was the tools used throughout history were just some improved, but they were repeated. So this data shows us that we have to be worried a little bit. Yeah. Well, let's see how we can spread the knowledge and to avoid the possibility to have another Holocaust. So how we teach Roma Holocaust effectively. And of course, one of the important calls is to decolonize the curriculum in the schools. In this case, we have to center Roma voices, to use testimonies and oral histories of survivors and their relatives. It's important. And it's strange how, in certain instances, even the few collected testimonies, yeah, are regarded as not accurate or, you know, forged. Well, there is a lot to say about this, but definitely that's the point to do. If we want to learn something about Roma Holocaust, let's listen to the victims, because they are the ones that went through that. And I'd say they know better. Well, challenge the dominant narratives and question why Roma Holocaust was forgotten, but forgotten in the sense from the public collective memory, not necessarily forgotten by Roma. And we have to connect the past to the present, yeah, and to look how anti-Gypsies worked and how it works nowadays, yeah. And of course, to promote critical thinking, to analyze sources and to question biases. And here are some key pedagogical principles. I'll just briefly mention them. Intersectionality, historical continuity, agency and resistance. And I am glad that Anna emphasized this point, that Roma were not just passive victims throughout history, yeah, but rather, yeah, they developed different strategies of survival, yeah. And of course, what is the contemporary relevance on educating about the Roma Holocaust? Well, how to develop some teaching tools, yeah, and how to address challenges. And here are some ideas, yeah. Well, on the one hand, to do document analysis exercises. Now with the development of new technologies, we can easily do that. To analyze, for example, yeah, what medieval chronicles depicted, how they depicted Roma, yeah, what the Nazi race laws and deportation orders, yeah, how they depicted and how they organized these processes, yeah, to analyze the survivor testimonies, yeah, or contemporary hate speech examples. I think this will be quite relevant and interesting as well for students. Well, here is even a timeline of activity. There are also role play scenarios that can be used. Well, addressing challenges, I'd say to look into what Holocaust denial and minimization does. Yeah, to use multiple sources to include survivor accounts and to use the comparison with Jewish Holocaust memorials. We all know that, our brothers and sisters, the Jewish community were very good in documenting and memorializing Holocaust, so we can compare that. But we can also look into student biases and stereotypes, and also one of the challenges is the lack of curriculum space. Yeah. Well, let me briefly talk about the contemporary approaches and how to build innovative curricula. On the one hand, we have the innovation in Roma Holocaust education, and we have digital storytelling, again using the new technologies, having interactive timelines and maps, virtual museum experiences, and this is highly attractive to all types of students. I'm not necessarily saying gamification, but I do think that the Roma Holocaust memorialization, should be based on virtual museums as well. Then community partnerships, involve Roma organizations, survivors to speak at different programs, and why not local history projects, invite, for example, students to document what is happening in their community, in their city or town. And the integration of art in the education on Roma Holocaust through theater and performance, through visual arts exhibition and creative writing and poetry. Now, when it comes to curricula, of course, the idea is to build an inclusive curricula that includes Roma history, that addresses anti-Gypsyism and other forms of racism, that incorporate Roma cultural contributions, and as a parenthesis, just, think how students would react to find out about different Roma contributions to culture and history in their communities. Well, how to move from education to action is also important, because on the one hand, we have to integrate Roma Holocaust into teaching practice, challenge stereotypes, seek ongoing professional and be relational with Roma communities, and these are rather individual commitments, but we have to think also institutional changes. We have to advocate for revising the curriculum. This will not happen, so easily, as we already know. Luckily, we have Council of Europe, which has done a lot of work along this route, and with the History Observatory, there is still place for improvement, and we do have allies to support our advocacy efforts, but also support Roma student success, we need also to create inclusive school environments. It's not only about the curriculum, but also certain practices happening in schools to eliminate, for example, bullying, yeah, or biases, including teachers' biases, yeah. And of course, it's also about community engagement, involving Roma organization to support commemorative events, yeah. Even though the commemoration of Roma Holocaust happens on August 2nd throughout Europe and even beyond, I think it's important that there are also national commemorative dates, yeah, that take into consideration the local history. Even for the 2nd of August, yeah, schools could organize events that attract students and the local community. To advocate for memorial sites, I just happened to learn that in United Kingdom, in Newcastle, they will unveil a memorial site now on August 2nd due to the efforts of Roma activists there. And of course, to promote public awareness. Yeah. Well, it took a long time to talk about this, and I want to leave some space for questions and answers. Now, I will welcome any question, of course, related to my presentation. Yeah. And I'll do my best to answer them. But I also prepared some questions that are related to future and how we can teach how we can teach Roma Holocaust, how we deal with Holocaust education in general. So here are the 4 questions I prepared for you, and I will welcome any ideas or sharing with us your own experiences. So we learn also from each other. How can we ensure Roma voices are centered in Holocaust education? Because that will also contribute to humanizing the victims, yeah? So it's not only dry texts and, data. The second question is, what are effective ways to address student prejudices? Yeah, I think this is really important. How also to make it attractive to the students, yeah, to study that. I think we have to go beyond just presenting numbers and this, but rather make it interesting for them, connected to what is their interest. So how do we connect historical persecution to contemporary discrimination or even situation of Roma? Even by just addressing, for example, why are Romas poor? Yeah? And challenging this kind of situations that, yeah. And then, of course, what role should Roma communities play in developing curricula and promoting Holocaust education? Now, I'll stop here and I will gladly interact and listen to your own experiences. Thank you very much.